Welcome to this week's J.C. Ralston Arboretum midweek programming. We are talking about a type of propagation, a type of propagation you could easily do at home. There are two basic forms of propagation, sexual and asexual. Sexual, in the case of flowering plants, would be from seed. And the asexual propagation is cloning, and it ranges from cuttings or the hardwood cuttings that we just stuck in the ground last week. But today we're going to talk about layering, and layering is different from other forms of asexual propagation in that the part that is being rooted is not removed from the parent plant until it has rooted. You know, when you think of a stem cutting or a root cutting or a leaf cutting, those parts of the plant have been removed from the parent plant and provided conditions that promote it to root and become a independent plant. But in layering, we don't separate the new rooted piece until it has succeeded rooting. There are a number of different types of layering, several of which I've only read about, never seen done. One of the advantages of layering is that it's more, you often will succeed in propagating through layering something that's difficult to root from stem cuttings because it is still attached to the parent plant. Neither method is one that's used very widely commercially. Well, let me grab this stem. If I was a nursery and I wanted to maximize the number of plants I produce, I could make multiple cuttings out of each of these stems. So out of this one branch, I probably could produce 30 plants. And so that's an advantage to the commercial nursery who has to produce very large numbers. But if you're a home gardener, you probably don't need 30 more plants of this Alyssium, but you might need one more plant or a couple more plants, or maybe, you have a camellia that your grandfather introduced and you're moving, and, you could take cuttings and start off with a teeny tiny plant, or you can air layer or just simple layering it and end up with a bigger plant in short order. That's what we're going to talk about today. We'll get back to air layering after we demonstrate this earlier type. A lot of woody plants, especially shrubs, will layer naturally if a stem is close enough to the ground and makes contact with the ground. They will root, and in time, that layer could be separated from the parent plant and replanted elsewhere. But of course, we're doing this intentionally, so we're going to make it happen, not just wait for it to happen. This deciduous shrub is a mock orange. Of course, several things have that common name, but this is a Philadelphus. And one point I should make is whenever we layer, we're cloning the plant. So the new plant we produce is going to be genetically identical to the parent. Whereas if we collected seed from this mock orange, we would produce mock orange seedlings, but they might not be identical to the parent. For one thing, this cultivar is one with yellow foliage, and maybe none of the seedlings have yellow foliage, maybe they're all green foliage. So when we use asexual propagation or cloning, as we're doing today, we're producing a genetically identical plant. So in this kind of layering, all you need is a limb that is close enough to the ground. Back here, there's a little piece that was probably layered on its own. Earlier, there must have been a stem that touched the ground and rooted in here, so that could be transplanted. But we can also take any stem that's low enough or flexible enough to reach the ground and bury it in the ground a little bit. Now, something that's real easy to root if you merely buried it and weighed it down so it would stay and put, it probably would root just fine. But injuring the stem a bit will promote rooting, because anytime you damage the stem and it produces callus, which is equivalent to our when we have a wound and it starts to heal, those undifferentiated cells are more likely to produce roots than the stem that's not damaged. And I'll demonstrate this when we do air layer. You can completely girdle the stem, or you can just injure the stem. Just a cut into the stem like that, or almost any kind of wound to the stem will promote rooting. And so then it's ready to go underground. I'm going to use this bed marker as a trowel. It actually works quite well here in our nice soil. And it's ready to go in the ground. Now there are going to be lots and lots of questions of, can I propagate X, Y, and Z plant using this method? And I would say anything that's reasonably easy to root probably could be layered in this way. In the nothing ventured, nothing gained, we certainly will try to answer such questions later on today. But, I would try this on almost anything you want to propagate. The most difficult things, like some conifers, are not going to root this way. But certainly most deciduous shrubs or broadleafed evergreens would eventually root. Now, this can be done any time of year. It doesn't really matter when you do it. It's now early February. By midsummer or so, this probably will be well rooted. The aftercare would be, once I've determined that it's rooted, I take the rock away and it doesn't pull out of the soil. At that point, I would sever the stem so it's no longer connected to the parent. I could transplant it at that time. I would probably give it a little bit more time to just establish now that it's no longer connected to mom. And also, being a deciduous shrub, I'd probably wait till it's gone leafless in the fall to transplant it anyway. But within 6 to 12 months, a lot of these things will root. And if they haven't rooted in that time frame, just leave them, and maybe they'll root next year or something. Sometimes people actually snap the stem when they put it underground, and then stake the stem upright. That's another. There's just a lot of variations on that theme. But this is a common deciduous shrub that's quite easy to root. I do think something that's going to hold it in place. It could be a stone, a brick, or like a landscape staple that's used on irrigation. Anything that's going to keep it secure in the ground. There's other things in this vicinity. This osmanthus. This particular plant has a lot of low-growing limbs, and actually that one feels like it's already layered. Yeah, this one is layered on its own. I'm so good at this that it rooted just with me thinking about it. Yeah, but this stem here, this piece here, has rooted in the ground, and yeah, I can't even pull it out of the ground. So that one could certainly be cut away from the parent plant and transplanted. But if we wanted additional ones, all of these low branches could be layered in that manner. You can try this on things like grapes. Some plants, like some raspberries and blackberries, tend to layer very readily on their own. Every time the stem grows up and arches to the ground, they tend to root almost immediately where they touch the ground. Plum yew, Cephalotaxis, especially these prostrate forms that are low to the ground, I would certainly give that a try. When we root them from stem cuttings, they're extremely slow, but they root in high percentages. They sometimes form a big knob of callus, but then take months and months before they put any roots out. But it wouldn't really matter if all you were looking for were a few additional plants. You could take a stem like that and, you know, I'd strip these needles off or leaves on a broadleafed evergreen. I'd wound the stem some. You can also just split the stem, which I'll try to do without cutting myself. But any kind of injury to the stem is going to promote rooting. And then that's ready to go underground. Another handy bed marker. Our beds have individual letters and numbers to distinguish one bed from another. But you know, that's ready to get buried in the ground. And I'll bring the rock over in a moment. But anyhow, I see this forsythia over here is doing a good job of layering on its own. Oh, thank you. They're throwing rocks at me now. Yeah. All right, yeah, there's my wound. I split the stem. We could even find a little stick here and put it in the wound, because we don't want the wound to heal up. We want it to remain a wound, and then bury it underground. And maybe by this fall it will have rooted. Time will tell. Okay. And as I mentioned, there's some shrubs that layer quite readily on their own. This forsythia has certainly been layering about. Wherever one of these stems eventually touches the ground, it'll root. There's a spirea in front of it that seems to be doing a good job of that on its own as well. So that's something to try at home. Chris, before we go on to air layering, do we want to entertain any questions specific to this kind of layering?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions yet, Doug.
Okay. Well, my mom showed us how to do this when I was a little kid, so probably everyone else had the same experience and been doing this all their lives. Air layering, like the kind of layering we already demonstrated today, again, has the distinction of the part we're rooting. It will remain attached to the plant. So I'm going to demonstrate on these cut stems just because it'll be easier to show you the steps in producing an air layer. We will not bother gluing these back onto the plant they came off of. So the technique I'm going to show you is done on the intact plant. So, and we'll demonstrate that as well, and also show you a few completed air layers. They're only done within the hour, so probably not yet rooted. You can do this work with a good pair of sharp pruning shears, or a good pruning knife. And I brought this sharpening steel because I don't use it on the pruning shears, but I'm more likely to use my knife than my pruning shears for a lot of forms of propagation. And I know when you go in a butcher shop, the butchers are always throwing their big knives with this held up in the air. I like to have it good and firm, so I'll rest it against something like the tabletop. And an interesting thing about sharpening a knife is that you're not trying to smooth out the blade, you're actually trying to rough up the edge of the blade, so you end up with what is essentially a very finely serrated edge to the blade. And I know when I sharpen my kitchen knife at home, you know, the tomato skins that are, you know, so thin but hard to cut with the dull knife, the sharpened kitchen knife will go right through them. Yeah, I can feel that's nice and roughed up now. So the basic materials we need are sphagnum moss. Now, sphagnum moss is not the same thing as peat moss. It is the parent material that becomes peat moss when it's further rotted, but this is long fiber. And I'm not promoting this brand, I'm just showing it's long fibered sphagnum moss. And I just got this in a garden center. Most garden centers will carry it. So you see it's long fibers. You know, you could probably succeed with air layering using peat moss, but it'd be really, really hard to keep it wrapped around the stem while you're trying to, you know, put it where it needs to be. And sphagnum moss is coming out of peat bogs. And there are some dried stems of little cranberry plants in here. So, you know, sphagnum moss is really useful for a number of horticultural. Oh, here it is. That's a little cranberry plant. It's long since dead, but you know, so when this sphagnum moss was harvested, some of the existing plants were also disturbed. When you buy it, the sphagnum moss will be bone dry, which is good because otherwise it would be rotting in the bag before you bought it. It's a little hard to hydrate if you just pour cold water over it. So I used our coffee pot and heated up a pot of water and poured it over the sphagnum moss, and it hydrates quite quickly with hot water. When you use it, you want it to, if it was really soggy, you want to wring it out so it's about the moisture level of a damp sponge after you've wrung the sponge out. More blueberry. Now the other things that are, you know, just your kitchen, you know, plastic wrap. And again, I'm not promoting any of these brands. They just happen to be what I had at home. I hope I don't get the phone call, you know, honey, where is the plastic wrap? But I specifically bought this foil for air layering. And the thing, I highly recommend that you get a heavy duty aluminum foil because it's so stiff, it goes a long ways to holding the big lump of sphagnum moss on the stem. Whereas if you use your normal grade of aluminum foil, it doesn't do as good a job of holding everything tightly on the stem. With the heavy-duty foil, you won't need to tie the plastic into place because this will keep everything nice and snug. And this size is more than big enough. I know you can buy much wider rolls, but even this is a little bit long, but it's pretty ideal size. This is a process where I'm probably benefit from wearing a pair of gloves. It's a different knife technique than when I'm processing cuttings. And here, a really, really curious thing, it always blows my mind that you could actually succeed in air layering something, is that you girdle the stem. Well, that's one way to do it. You see, I've completely removed the bark around the whole length of the stem. And, you know, I'm just going to do another cut on the stem just so I can demonstrate it. You know, and it's easier to do it on this cut stem because I can move the stem more than when it's still attached to the plant. And that's a bit small. I usually make them at least an inch long. So go all the way around. And I will say, you know, if you're not comfortable with the knife, pruning shears work well too. You know, it's a little bit like when you're stripping the plastic coating off of an electrical wire. You want to, you know, cut it far enough so you're just cutting the plastic, but not so far that you're cutting the electrical wire or cutting the stem. And I think it also helps if you put a lengthwise slice and then you start removing the bark. There's a term used, the term is, when the bark is slipping, and in the dead of winter, the bark won't slip too much, but when the sap starts to flow, then the bark comes off readily. And actually, it's coming off real readily. I actually just grabbed these stems of Elysium, star anise, and they prove to be one that's real easy to strip the bark off. All right, we've stripped the outer layer of bark, but you see that stem is still green. That's the cambium. Believe it or not, you want to get rid of all of that. If you leave it there, the stem's going to heal up. I know you're saying this can't possibly be successful. We hope to do a number of layers, some of them today and some after we're done with this presentation, and come back, maybe about October or so, and see if we've had any success. Of course, one obstacle here is that we have lots of visitors, and curious visitors might want to see why that aluminum foil is around a stem and on a plant in the garden. So, it has to survive our curious visitors as well. So I am scraping the cambium off, and yeah, that's looking good. Now, how could this possibly work? Well, what happens is, and normally there'd be just one layer here, but for the purpose of this, well, here, we'll do this. Okay, so I don't confuse you. So this, and again, this is still attached to the plant in the real world. What happens is you have two types of conductive vessels in a stem. Xylem and phloem. Xylem is the water is traveling through the xylem from the roots up into the plant. That still happens. And so this top of the plant above the air layer is not going to, dry out because it's still getting water from the roots. And this upper part of the plant with all its wonderful foliage is still photosynthesizing and producing food and nourishing the plant. And normally, the plant uses whatever sugars it needs when it respires. If it has any excess sugar, it gets translocated down the phloem to the roots or other parts of the plant. But because we've removed the cambium and the phloem here, it can't go past this point. So food actually accumulates here, which increases the chance of rooting. So that's how it manages to survive, though. If you're like me, when I look at it, it's still hard to believe that that's possible, that it could survive for, 9 months or so. Now, this is a really common practice amongst camellia lovers. And I've worked with some of them. That's where I first, well, no, that's not true. When I was a preteen, I had to air layer my rubber plant because it got too tall. My grandfather showed me how to do it. But, when I was working in the camellia world, a lot of the camellia growers, showed me their techniques of air layering. And some use rooting hormones and some don't. I'd be inclined to use rooting hormone just because it increases your chance of success and probably speed up rooting as well. I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy a different rooting product if you already had one on hand. You could use powders or the liquids or the gels. Nowadays, we're super big fans of gels, the rooting gels for things that are more difficult to root. We don't use the gels on things that are real easy to root. But, I'd feel fine about using gels on something like a camellia or something. So we'd apply it to, well, the base of the stem, the part that's being air layered. And then, well, I need one other thing. This is one way to injure the stem, is this complete girdling of the stem. You see I've gone all the way around the stem. Another option is just, and I would remove leaves that are going to end up where the stem is being layered. Another one is just, and I guess it might be better to do that with a knife, but I feel a little bit more comfortable with the pruning shears. You know, another method of wounding them would be to split the stem like that. And you'd put your rooting hormone in there. That's not a complete girdling, but it's certainly a major wounding of the stem. And again, wounding with the production of callus cells, and callus cells are more likely to become whatever cell is in need. And you know, what the plant needs at this point is a root system. Okay, so that's the first step in air layering. The next step, well, actually, this is one of those things where it'd be good to have more than two hands. And I'm going to demonstrate it myself. You know, these cling wraps that are real clingy are wonderful if they don't get all tangled up before you're ready for them. But this is already properly wrung out, and it's going to get quite compacted. So this looks like a ridiculous amount, but you know, it's mostly fluff. And so, and I would err on the side of too much rather than too little, because this has to stay moist between now and, you know, this fall. And this is the point where it's actually maybe easier when it's still on the plant, because I'm not also supporting the stem at that point. Trying to wrap it tightly. You know, if you felt you wanted to make it more secure, you could tie it, or, you know, use a grafting rubber band, right? And this cling wrap is pretty, doing a good job of staying in place. Now, because I want the foil to be a little bit less noticeable, I'll actually put the less shiny side on the outside. So this is when you can start making sure everything's nice and tight. And it's probably more important to make the bottom tight, because if rain went in there, that'd be actually probably beneficial. And we have completed this air layer. Now we're going to mostly just leave it alone and start checking it in the fall. And, you know, you can check it by opening the foil, and, you know, you might see roots through the plastic. Or if you don't, you can, you know, open the plastic a little bit and poke around a bit. But they often have a good root system by that. And, you know, if we succeed in rooting that, that's a whole lot bigger than if we did it from a stem cutting. Because if we did a stem cutting, you know, the stem cutting would be, you know, about that size. And that's a big difference. But again, if your goal was to produce 300 of these plants, you'd go with stem cuttings rather than layers. Now, some people don't use the plastic, they just use the foil. And there's other variations. Some people take like a plastic Dixie cup or something, slit it down one side, cut a hole in the bottom, and put it around the stem, and then stuff that with moss. And because it's open on the top, and because sphagnum moss stays moist for a fairly long time, it probably stays moist enough unless rains have totally stopped. And you can also buy similar devices, which are like two halves of the Dixie cup, which clasp around the stem. And, you know, I don't know that your success rate would be better with one or the other, but, you know, this doesn't cost much money. Whereas you start buying devices specifically made for air layering, I suspect they cost, you know, several dollars each or something. Well, that's the basic technique. We can go demonstrate it on actual plant and show you a couple that are in place.
Doug, you had a moment for some questions earlier. There's no question, but can we do a couple of questions right now?
Absolutely.
We just had a really good one that I think might be important to cover. I'm sure you covered it earlier when I was busy helping people in the chat, so I missed it. But someone just asked, should the plants be layered connected to the mother plant?
Oh, well, of course, yes.
Yes, I wanted everyone to realize that, yes, they should be connected to the mother plant. We're just doing this for video purposes, so Doug's not stuck in the middle of a shrub where you can't see him. So this is just a quick little demonstration. The reason why they're kept attached to the mother plant, because that's a great source for water and nutrients, and it keeps the cutting alive while it's being rooted. Layering is often done for some plants that are fairly hard to root and might take months and months and months to root. So layering works out really good for those. But it's also an easy way to do it even for hydrangeas and other things that root readily.
Yeah. You know, maybe that person got into the, or arrived later than others, but I did. It's always good to emphasize that again. When you're air layering, you never cut the stems off the plant. They're attached to the mother plant, because that's why you succeed with air layering, because in the many months that it has no roots at all, it's still attached to the parent plant, and the parent plant is supplying water to the top of the plant. There's just no way this would succeed unless it was still attached to the parent plant. And that is what distinguishes layering from other forms of propagation, in that the part that is being rooted is still attached to the parent plant. And I could quickly mention a couple other types of layering. One is called stooling, where, you know, again, we'll pretend that this is an entire shrub. In stooling, the whole parent plant is cut to the ground. When it starts to regrow, you start mounding soil up around all those new sprouts. And because those new sprouts are very soft, because they're brand new shoots, and because you're covering them with soil and they're getting, what's the word, blanched like celery, you know, they're not developing chlorophyll, they're more likely to produce roots. And that is what, you know, again, that is a method that I've never done, and has had some use in commercial nursery propagation. But, you know, the book I had in college was still, you know, a book of stone tablets. So, you know, the modern propagation methods have really increased the ability to root things that had been difficult to root. So a lot of these other methods of air layering are not probably in much use at all nowadays. But, you know, the stooling is one possibility. And the other one is trench layering, where a young plant is grown. And then, you know, come about this time of year, it is tilted over, is cut back lightly, it is buried under soil. And then when it puts up new shoots from the stems, you know, growing up through the soil, those will root as well. So it's sort of a variation on stooling where the plant is buried. You know, and those are methods that I've never used, I've only read about, but it is something that you could certainly try at home. And the stooling and the trench layering, and stooling is also called mound layering, but mound layering and trench layering are you know, something we could all try at home if we had something that was we had failed to root using any other method.
I seem to remember the stump or mound layering was used commercially for making apple root stocks.
That's true. That's one thing. You know, I reread about these types of layering this morning, and they were talking about some of the apple understocks that are produced by mound layering.
Yeah. So we have several questions, but I think might be all combined into one. Some people are wondering about watering. What's the care of your layered plant through time? What do you do until fall? Things like that. How quickly is it going to go dry in that bag? How do you rewater it, for instance?
Well, most often people aren't doing anything with them. They're doing them this time of year, and then they're check back in on them in the fall. Now, if we had an awful summer where it was dry for months, I might check in periodically and add water. If the layer is upright like this, some water is going to get in the top when it rains. Now, a couple of the layers I did earlier are more horizontal, so they might be a little bit more dependent on being watered, but you can check in periodically. There's usually not much care necessary during the process of rooting.
So Doug mentioned earlier, some people have used a pot instead of the plastic and the tin foil. That's how I've always done mine.
Okay.
Because I just keep them watered in that case.
Yeah.
But one thing I think is a little interesting with this, while this is a demonstration being done for video purposes, we're not quite doing it on the mother plant, as you can tell. I do believe that the cutting that Doug, or not the cutting, but the branch sample that Doug has, that's as big as you can do it. You can do much larger than you would normally do from typical cuttings.
Yeah, yeah.
So you can considerably a larger plant.
I've never air layered an Alyssium. I have layered camellias. I've seen people layer camellias, and to layer a camellia branch this size is pretty common. And of course, I'm not. What I mean is that people succeed in layering a camellia branch this big. So done in February, maybe harvested in October, they already have this size plant. We could stick this cutting this time of year, or we'd stick it in the spring or summer. And at the end of this summer, it might be a foot tall. So we have a much bigger plant ready to go.
My most recent plant that I layered was almost an entire holly at home. It was a Carissa holly. I wanted to ensure that I could move it to a different location. I didn't want to kill it accidentally by digging it up. And I just took a 5-gallon container plant or pot, slid it down the sides, wrapped around the trunk, and filled it with potting soil, and kept it watered for the growing season, and moved it the next winter. And it did very well. And that thing had almost a 2-inch caliber on it.
Yeah, and I'm glad Chris mentioned pots, because, the kind of layering we showed earlier, where you're just burying a above ground stem in soil, can certainly be done with container plants. If you had a house plant with sprawly stems and your inclination is to cut them off and root them, well, you could also, we'll pretend this is a pot. Let's say you have a dumb cane, a Dieffenbachia here, and it's developed these long sprawly stems. They've developed these long sprawly stems out of the pot. Well, and we'll pretend that this is a pot. This is Doug's make-believe hour. You could take these stems and essentially plant them in the neighboring pot and probably not break them like I just did. And then once they're rooted, cut them off from the original plant and have a new pot of it. It's a more surefire way of succeeding in rooting it, especially if it's something that's a little bit more difficult to root. But a lot of tropicals are real easy to root.
I'm gonna come over here for a quick little science talk, if you guys will put up with me.
Oh, I'm happy for it.
Where's your earlier? Oh, it's buried inside here, right?
You can disassemble it.
I don't want to disassemble it. It's awfully cute. There's been questions in the chat about water transport and how things work. When Doug girdled the stem earlier, he only went down to the cambium layer, only took out the outermost layer. So the root system of the plant through the xylem can still transport water and nutrients up to the top. And that is why the top part, or the branch you're layering, remains alive, because it's still getting all the water and nutrients from the root system. But when you girdle it, the phloem, which is the transport from the top down to the roots, has been severed. So all the sugars and the hormones collect in that little cut that Doug has made on this plant. And they collect right above there, and that is where the plant is going to root, and that's why it works. If you dig really deep down into the wood, past the xylem that's working, you're going to cut off the water flow, your cutting's going to wilt and die. So you just cut gently down. If you ever peeled bark off of a stem, that's the natural layer that you want to cut down to. And that is assuming your plant is a dicot. If it's a monocot, they have different structures on the inside. Those you just do a slit into it and cut them, just cut the whole stem partially, because they have little xylem and phloem bundles. They're not layered like a woody plant. If you ever cut down a tree and it has the rings in it, that's your layers of the xylem going on. So that monocots and dicots are a little bit different, but that's a little bit of the science behind how the plants will still stay alive with the water transport still working.
Thank you, Chris. Do we have additional questions, or is it time for us to walk over to
I've been ignoring the questions because we were having a nice conversation. How about if we go ahead and move? We'll get you started over there, and then I can review the questions while you're doing the next part. How's that sound?
Sounds groovy. We are going to attempt an air layer on this willow oak. We're going to girdle it about 5 feet off the ground all the way around and load it up with sphagnum moss and see if we succeed in rooting it. Oh, wrong direction, this direction. This is one I did. Are you ready for me, or should I hold on? Sure, I'm sorry. Okay, this is an air layer I did earlier today. It was the first one I did, and I thought I had a generous amount of moss, and by the time I squished down the foil, it's a little bit on the small side, but we'll see what it does. The girdling is about here. This branch is a horizontal one, so I'm not sure any water from a rainstorm will enter it, so I might need to check that periodically over the summer. This is a hybrid camellia. It's one of those winter hardy ones that has Camellia oleifera in it, but Camellia oleifera is very similar to Camellia sasanqua. So, you know, this is the second one I did. Oh, squeeze that foil a little bit. You know, again, maybe you don't, if you don't have heavy duty foil at home in your kitchen and you're tempted just to use the lightweight, I really would recommend that you use the heavy duty, because I can squeeze this tighter and it just stays in place. Really nice, but that's a chunkier one. Again, it's a horizontal stem. And again, you know, making the point that when you air layer, the air layer is always still attached to the parent plant until it's either it roots or it dies, at which point you cut it off. And if it's dead, you throw it away. If it's rooted, well, then you pot it or plant it out. Now, I want to actually try to demonstrate air layering on the intact plant. You all help me understand which stem would show up well for you. I'm going to do a more upright stem. If I keep this branch out of the way, can we work on this stem here? Would that work? Okay, and maybe just so it's not in the way, I'll take this little side branch off there because it's a sort of no account. Okay. Now, if these camellia air layers succeed, I'm going to plant the new plants out in the sun, because this is under this huge willow oak, and they do fine, but Camellia sasanqua and oleifera will really bloom heavily if they're grown out in sun. Japonica is a bit happier in shade. So we have this nice straight part of the stem, and this is the same technique I displayed over on the table. Again, I'm using a knife. You can also do that with pruning shears. So to girdle about an inch length of stem, is that about what you would do, Chris? About an inch? Okay. So, now I'm sure imagine this doesn't show up all that well. But once I have the bark off, it'll be evident. Ring the bark top and bottom. Now making the lengthwise slit just to facilitate removing the bark. And when I did those two layers that I showed you just now, this camellia bark isn't slipping as readily as the anise bark, but that bottom ring is especially important so that when I'm stripping the bark, it just goes to that ring rather than just continuing on or no distinct starting spot. And Chris, I don't know if I scrape so none of the green is left on it. Is that what you do?
Scraping. So none of the green is left.
Oh yeah, you can scrape.
All right. Well, I wasn't sure from your explanation a moment ago whether I was going too far, but I've always
Don't
been
scrape too deep, Doug.
No, I was always told you get all that green off, because if that green's there, this girdled part of the stem will heal and it won't be girdled anymore. And it might be, if you're not comfortable with a knife, it might be easier to make that initial ring at the top and the bottom of the girdle with your pruning shears. But I suspect it might be easier to scrape the bark off with a knife because the rest of the pruning shear is not in the way. All right. Yeah. Getting there. I wonder how many people in the audience are covering their eyes right now because they can't bear seeing this being done to this poor plant. Hopefully come October or so, we'll come out here and discover our abuse of this plant has not been without benefit, because we ended up with a nice new plant. Let me do one thing. Let me put my reading glasses on. Better, thank you. Yeah. I feel like when I'm working on the underside that must be blocking the view of this. Yeah, this is the most time-consuming part of this process, is scraping all that green off. Okay. All right, that's quite good. See, it's looking more tan than green. Everybody happy with that? Okay. So now I'm gonna jump past Alexander and grab you. Alexander, you're good. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to have my piece of saran wrap ready. Grab a big handful of the moss. Again, that looks like so much until I start compressing it. Am I, Lordy? The saran wrap is a little bit like garden hoses. You can't live with them, can't live without them. They're, they're great when they're not all tangled up, but there we go. We're making progress. Okay. And, as I said, I know some people who layer camellias frequently and don't use the plastic wrap. And I think that would work better on a stem that's upright like this, because it'll catch some rain that'll infiltrate from the top. All right. Yeah, that's looking pretty promising. Thank you. And, sometimes we end up with somebody's mylar balloon that has escaped and ends up in our trees here at the Arboretum. And so somebody's going to see something shining in these camellias and think that it's somebody's mylar balloon, but no, it's going to be one of these layers. Of course, I could come back with some black spray paint and spray them black, so probably no one would notice them. All right, making that nice and tight. The tight is to keep the moist sphagnum moss in nice snug contact with the stem. And I haven't used rooting hormone on here. Again, if I was going to use rooting hormone, obviously I would have put it on the top of that cut before covering up with moss. And I will do some additional layers and use rooting hormone on them, and we can see whether they had a higher rate of success than these ones that I didn't treat. Okay, so that's the process. And again, we will return in the fall and do a midweek program, and hopefully be able to show you that we have had some success with propagating camellias through air layering. And of course, try this on other plants as well. I don't know, are there a million questions about, can I try it on this or that?
So those questions are a lot rarer than last week, Doug, where we left the program with, I think, 60 questions.
Yeah.
One of the good questions that we had recently is, how much rooting should you see in the bag before the plant's removed? How much development should there be? Just some helpful guidelines for when it's safe to remove the plant remove the cutting, what do you want to call it, the new plant from the other plant.
I don't really know if it's the case, but I'd be inclined to want to harvest something before winter sets in again this coming winter. Because, camellias, or this type of camellia, are fully winter hardy in this area, but their roots are protected down in the soil. So if it was above ground and we were 14 degrees like we were last week, the roots might be killed by those temperatures. So, if I didn't see any rooting at all, I might just leave it and maybe it'll root the following season. If I'm seeing some rooting, then I would harvest it. And, maybe it's time to talk about aftercare. Generally, when one of these layers succeed, I would be more inclined to grow it in a pot and pamper it in a pot rather than planting it directly in the ground, unless it was something like an acuba that by the time it roots has a huge root system. But I think something like a lot of the things, when they do an air layer, I'd be inclined to pamper it in a nursery over its first winter and then plant it out in the spring.
So this is kind of akin to transplanting a plant, which means digging a plant out of a landscape and you sever a good part of its root system, that it's going to wilt. It's going to need some extra care. So I would fully agree with keeping it in a container in a shadier environment, to have more control over it. One thing I started to type in the chat, I don't know how thoroughly I put it in there, but at least what I wanted to say is sometimes the most difficult part in layering is just getting the plant to root. And once it has rooted, those roots can develop relatively fast. Some things can just take months and months and months, but once they go, they're ready to go.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Some things are really slow to root, but once they start, And if you pot this camellia up in the fall and it's in not a heated space, but a space where the roots won't freeze over winter, the roots will grow all winter.
So we had a good question in there about doing this rhododendron, and of course I said this is a very common way from rhododendrons, and I'm assuming that they were talking about the classic rhododendron, not things like azaleas and those other ones which are readily propagated. But rhododendrons don't root from cuttings all that successfully or very quickly, and even from layering I think can take quite a while, but it's a great way to do it.
And rhododendrons, you could do air layers, or if it has low limbs, you could also just layer them in the soil like we started off today.
Well, we did just have a good question for a particular type of taxa, Doug. Annabelle was questioning witch hazels, and I think that one might be worth addressing because those are typically grafted, and it would certainly be nice to layer one of those because you wouldn't have the rootstock growing up.
Yeah, I would definitely try witch hazel. And the reason why they're grafted is because they are fairly hard to root, but also not very often don't survive when they're first rooted. They won't survive their first winter. So I would certainly try layering one of the fancy hybrid witch hazels that are normally grafted.
So I tried to layer my Traveler Redbud.
Okay.
Totally unsuccessful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did that one just as an experiment because I enjoyed that plant quite a bit. I love Traveler, but there wasn't even a hint or a hair of anything happening on that after a full year. So some plants just don't do it, but redbuds are definitely known not to be doing stuff like that.
Yeah, not all redbuds though. Traveler is a selection of our native eastern redbud, Cercis canadensis, and they are almost impossible to root and probably therefore almost impossible to layer. But the Chinese redbuds, like Cercis chinensis and hybrids of it, are often quite easy to root.
So Sally has just asked, when's the preferred time for layering? I think now's a great time.
Well, again, I mentioned that as a kid, a preteen, I air layered my rubber plant, the house plant, rubber plant. And, being a tropical and growing year round, you could air layer them anytime.
Yeah.
The traditional time to layer camellias is late winter, early spring. So now is a really good time.
And you have your finished plant sometime during the summer or into the fall, and you cut it off the plant before the fall or before the winter comes.
And was her question specifically about air layering, or?
I think it just said layering. It didn't specify.
Well, the kind of layering where you're just burying a stem in the ground, I don't think the time matters at all because you're just doing it and, eventually coming back to it and figuring out whether it's layered or not. But air layering, depends on what it is. I would think late winter, early springs might be the best time for a lot of hardy things.
Yeah, I agree. The ground layering, do it any time of the year. I think I just automatically assumed air layering for that one protocol. So Annabelle just commented that she thought the Traveler was the Texas redbud. Yes, it is, but the Texas redbud is like a variety of a form of the Eastern redbud. It's just kind of a Western version of it, but it's still a stinker when it comes to rooting, and that one is very much grafted.
And there's probably been times when its name has been Cercis texensis, but now it's thought to, as Chris said, just a sub-variant of canadensis.
Yeah. We have had a few questions in here about a lot of houseplants, like Robin right now is asking about Dracaena.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Houseplants will quite often root just on their own readily, just in potting media, so you don't need to go through all the extra effort for rooting them this way. Doug mentioned his rubber tree, and I think that's one that's classically layered.
Yeah.
Because it does take a long time to root otherwise. But something like a Dieffenbachia or a pothos or things like that, I think you just put them in soil and they'll root.
Well, when I was in college, I worked in this large nursery that was strictly houseplants. And this was in, northern New Jersey near New York City. And they would get rootless, leafless Dracaena canes of various lengths, and I don't mean like short pieces. I mean, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot canes, a real common sight. I haven't seen them since this morning. you know, you see the Dracaenas in pots where there's 3 stems and each one is a different height and they're just putting out foliage. Well, those came from some plantation in a frost-free part of either, you know, South Florida or, I don't know, Puerto Rico or someplace tropical. And they just merely cut the canes off with no roots, no leaves, and they just get stuck in a pot and they root that way. And, you know, probably a couple months later, they're ready for sale.
One thing to note for many of the house plants, something like the Dracaena, if I'm not mistaken, and the Dracaena, those are monocots. So you don't girdle them because you can't girdle them. They don't have secondary growth. They don't have the layering process. They're a monocot, so they have the bundles. You would just nick them a little bit. Mary Ann just asked about Hedychium, and I put in the chat earlier for one of the questions, Hedychium doesn't have any above ground stems to layer. That stem is below ground already, and it naturally layers as it travels below ground. So you just divide them and you get new plants that way. Everything above ground on Hedychium or things like bananas are just layers of leaves. So no way to have a stem above ground on those, so nothing to layer.
Yeah, and Hedychium are the ginger lilies, and it is first cousin to the culinary ginger and turmeric and stuff. And so the true stem is a rhizome is an underground stem. And so the ginger that you use in the kitchen, you know, it's not a root, it's a rhizome, which is an underground stem. You know it's a stem and not a root because it has buds. Roots don't have buds.
So we had a question here about a specific plant, but I think there's also something else that they're wondering about. So we're gonna get rid of the specific plant because many of the plants will layer, and this one definitely is the case. But can you do small cuttings or small branches with this method?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Big ones. But...
Yeah. You can layer much smaller branches. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But you know, if
bigger, you just get a couple years worth of growth out of it that way.
Yeah. You know,
start off with.
We could layer this stem here about where my fingers are, and it's, you know, a lot smaller than the other layers I did today. But you know, still. That's a whole lot bigger than, you know, all these little stems here could be treated as separate cuttings, but we could layer this and it's already a whole lot bigger than a stem cutting.
So yeah, layering, you can do small cuttings, but you can also do big, and sometimes big is of a benefit. You have a much larger plant, hopefully quicker that way. Well, I think that might take care of the questions I was seeing. I might have skipped a few, so if we're missing something, go ahead and ask it again. Otherwise, I think we're done here. Any last minute questions, anybody? Well, they're either not fast typers or there are no more questions. So thank you so much, Doug, for being here today to talk about layering.
Sure.
And of course, thank you for Alexander, for Lise, for doing today's filming, and they did a great job. And really appreciate your help with the program. And definitely a big thanks to everyone that came by today and joined us for the program. I did notice we had a lot of people saying that they had video and audio problems throughout the entire program. We had no difficulties with ours. Keep in mind, Zoom does have updates that you need to do regularly, so just go ahead and check for updates on your Zoom program. And if you have difficulty with audio or video, turn Zoom off and turn it back on again and see what's going on. We always have a cell phone and we run it separately to ensure that we have video and audio, so we know that we're good. And I even called down below to the building and they were good down there. It was just weird to see so many people with video problems today. So try to update your Zoom and see if that helps. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you, hopefully on Saturday. But if not Saturday, hopefully next Wednesday for a midweek with Mark. Have a great week.
Thank you. Bye.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.